legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com. And today I'd like to say a word about one of the most intriguing wrinkles in the whole COVID-19 pandemic story that has come to my attention since all of this kicked off. Now, many commentators have weighed in with various theories that challenge the mainstream narrative of COVID-19, saying that this really isn't what you think it is. Here's what I think it is. Here's some evidence to support that. However, in May of last year, 2020, something came to my attention that was really beyond the extraordinary and beyond anything that I'd actually considered. And I saw a comment on social media. It wasn't by someone that I've connected with or knew. And it said, basically, I have heard, so the information was second-hand or third-hand to this person who posted this. They said, I've heard that what we're being told about the pandemic is very far from the truth. Here's what's really going on. Something out in space is approaching the Earth, and the chances of it impacting are very high. So it could be an asteroid, comet, whatever. The idea behind the lockdown essentially is that if this is going to happen, part or all of the Earth could be destroyed, and the powers that be think it will be best if we all spent some time at home with our families, as you might want to do if you knew that your death was imminent. You might not want to be at the office. You might not want to be in the park. You might not want to be halfway around the world from where you actually live. You might want to be at home with and surrounded by those that you love and who love you. So I immediately started looking for evidence for this, and the first thing that came to mind was that a radio guest colleague of mine, Thomas Sheridan, I'm sure most of you are familiar with his work, he had been bringing to our attention many media stories, and I'd seen some of these independently as well, talking about objects out there in space headed for Earth, and talking about how narrowly they were going to miss the Earth if they did so at all. So basically there were a lot of near-miss news stories about comets, asteroids, other bodies, material out there. So I thought to myself, could there actually be something to this? Now, ultimately, I was never able to tie it all together into anything coherent, but it really caught my interest as a different way to think about the pandemic lockdowns, because so much of the pandemic response has seemed so irrational. So I thought, well, could this possibly explain it? And a lot of people feel that the threat from comets and asteroids and other things that might strike the Earth is fairly remote, even though most people accept that although the dinosaurs as a whole were already on their way out when the Earth was struck all those millions of years ago, that certainly hastened their demise in a big way and completely changed the face of the Earth in terms of life on the planet. But we don't have to go back very far. The Tunguska event, which took place in Siberia in 1908, that involved an object entering the Earth's atmosphere, heading down. It didn't actually hit the ground, it actually exploded in an airburst several kilometers over the ground. But that occurred in almost a wilderness area of forest, practically uninhabited area. But nonetheless, this relatively small object, you can just look this up online, Tunguska event, if you want to get the details. It destroyed 2,000 square kilometers of forest into trees just completely flattened. Now that's not huge in terms of like the size of a city, for example. One of the news stories that I mentioned earlier, talking about near miss events, was actually talking about something that if it did hit the Earth, it would be around about Sydney in Australia, and that's maybe 10 times the area of the Tunguska event in terms of its size. But nonetheless, can you imagine the entire central business district or a whole bunch of suburbs of Sydney being completely flattened by something, not even as big as a car? So then the other point to make is that, to bear in mind when thinking about this, is that the Earth is under constant bombardment by material, shall we say, radiation, cosmic rays, but also actual physical objects, rocks, essentially. But the vast majority, vast majority, either burn up in the atmosphere on entry, or they make it to the Earth and they're so small and so unthreatening that, unless you happen to be in your backyard and got hit directly on the head by one of these things, it's not going to harm anybody or anything. And we also have, and bear in mind that a lot of these events that occur, for example, you think back to that cataclysmic event that hastened the demise of the dinosaurs so many millions of years ago, but we tend to think in very narrow frames of time because of how long we live, and human history goes into prehistory only a few thousand years back. You get back to 10,000 BC, a little bit more than that, and everything becomes very, very hazy. So we're working with these very small amounts of periods of time, and these cosmic events tend to happen at intervals spread over much greater periods of time. But we're under constant bombardment, and there is some evidence, for example, that going back, I mentioned 10,000 BC, so going back, say, to the time of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and prior to that, that something occurred that caused human beings to move underground, and it looks like it probably wasn't a single event. It looks like it was a change in the Earth's, the conditions on the Earth in general over a much longer period of time. So there's lots of evidence for, we can still see them, caves, humans returning to occupy caves. There are lots of networks of underground tunnels around the Earth. Some of them are incredibly complex, and they're over a number of stories. So they go down level upon level upon level, room after room, corridor after corridor. And they were evidently, these took a long time to construct, and they were not designed like an air raid shelter where you just pop down there for a couple of hours. They were designed to be lived in over the medium to long term. So the question is, what prompted that? You don't undertake that construction and make that move if you're facing a passing threat. If there was some risk of an object striking the Earth and causing a lot of damage, you wouldn't have time to undertake all that construction. So it looks like there was maybe a period of time when radiation from space, cosmic rays, which by the way are constantly raining down on the planet all the time, but a bit like solar activity, that can increase and decrease over time. So that looks like it was a very real threat in the past, and there's no reason why that couldn't happen again. And in fact, I mentioned Göbekli Tepe. For those of you who don't know, again, look up the history of that site. Not only does it have a lot to tell us about the abilities and the level that our so-called hunter-gatherer ancestors were at that time, that site was buried deliberately. It was completely covered over, not destroyed, but all the years that were taken to construct that site, and it's just incredible. And at some point, the people there abandoned it, but not before burying it. And that would suggest that it was being covered up so that it could be excavated again in the future, hopefully, and reused again. Use would commence once again. I mentioned cosmic rays. Well, in the context of that, I mentioned solar activity. This is another thing that could contribute to this sort of crisis. You could have a coronal mass ejection of the sun, just a huge outburst of energy that would blast itself from the sun out through the solar system. Now, we have layers of protection here on Earth that some other planets in the solar system do not have, but they're not infinitely powerful. And if any of you have heard of the Carrington event, which took place in the 1800s, affected mainly the US, but that was due to solar electromagnetic activity, and that at the time it was not a technologically advanced society, obviously, but they did have the beginnings of our modern communications technology. They had telegraphs, and it completely wiped out the whole telegraph system. And if you fast forward then to our current society, high tech, completely reliant on electronic communications and the internet and all the other networks, the matrix of stuff that we live within, that everything is dependent on. If there was a solar outburst, a coronal mass ejection, an electromagnetic pulse, we could be sent back to the Dark Ages in the blink of an eye. And we do not have the materials, the manpower to put all that back. It would take years if it was ever done. And one of the main problems with that is what might happen in the meantime. You know, if reconstruction started after an event like that, what changes might happen in society? Would we still be in the same place after the decades it would take to rebuild? I don't think it could be done. So all of this is just to emphasize how we're living in this active solar system with a star, our star, the sun, at the heart of it. And there's all sorts of material coming from within the solar system, from without the solar system, constantly moving, cosmic rays, rocks of all sizes, constantly bombarding us. It's just that we mostly don't notice, but at any point in the blink of an eye, that could change. Now, at this point, I want to mention catastrophism, which is in general the idea, in terms of the Earth and what I've been speaking about, is that major destructive upheavals have happened on the planet in the past, mostly the distant past, that have profoundly affected the course of life on Earth, including human life. But it's not widely discussed or really accepted, mainly due to the differences in timescales that I mentioned a few moments ago. Connected with this is the idea of collective species trauma, and this is something that I have tried to develop to explain why we appear to be so psychotic and dysfunctional. And the central idea is that in the past, on more than one occasion, something terrible has happened on the Earth that's affected life on Earth, including humans, and that as a result of one or more of these events, we have unresolved trauma, collective species trauma, that's affected us at an epigenetic level. It's affected evolution. Now, the first time I came across these ideas was through the writings of a guy called Immanuel Velikovsky, and he was writing back after the Second World War, into the 50s and onwards. And he presents a number of very interesting scenarios, and he's been widely criticized as being just off the mark. And no, this is, you just don't have the information to back this up. But as Graham Hancock, one of my other radio guests, pointed out when I discussed this with him, because Hancock has discussed the possibility of past catastrophes affecting life on Earth, and he's working with much more up-to-date information. Velikovsky was working with what he had at the time. So I've fished out a couple of his books here, which I haven't looked at for many years. First one here, not necessarily in order of publication, by the way, Worlds in Collision. And that kind of says it all in terms of objects from out in space, arriving here, hitting the Earth, doing tremendous damage, causing tremendous upheaval, changing the course of life on Earth. Another one, Earth in Upheaval. Now, as you can see the image there, that's talking more about geology, And we know that there have been tremendous volcanic eruptions and that have caused huge changes in life on Earth here, mainly due to ash cloud that has persisted for years and even decades, effectively being like a nuclear winter. And there's one theory that I read about, I can't quite remember the exact details, but there was a volcanic eruption apparently many thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, in the Indian subcontinent. And that may have reduced the human population from what would only have been, a few million down to a few thousand. That was it. We almost lost it, or we were almost snuffed out. And by the way, when I was talking earlier about networks of underground tunnels around the world, remember that you'd have been looking at a tiny, tiny population globally then. So the question is not, well, how could billions of people live underground? It wouldn't have been billions. It would have been hardly any compared to what we're dealing with now. And speaking directly to collective species trauma, from Velikovsky, once again, we have mankind in amnesia. And I think that pretty much says it all. We've forgotten something terrible that happened, but we feel it, we know it subconsciously, but we can't articulate it. We don't know what it is or where it came from. And we could effectively do with some form of therapy in order to get closure on some of these things. But of course, as I've been saying, the next event could be just around the corner. We're all probably familiar with the myth of Atlantis and its destruction, and also the biblical story of the flood. Now, some of you may already be aware, but these flood myths, stories of deluge, are universal across the world. And I think this is something, I think there's a reality to these flood myths. When I say myth, it's commonly taken to mean something that is not true, but it doesn't really. That's not actually the definition of myth. I think it's just a story that's been written around real events in order to preserve it in the most effective way and hand it on, sometimes making it symbolic to reduce trauma, or a bit like fairy tales do, classic fairy tales. So I think there's something to this, and it may be connected to the end of the last ice age and relatively rapid increase in global temperatures, resulting in massive melting of ice over a fairly short period of time, inundation, and we see evidence for this all over the world of remains of settlements, of monuments, statues, all sorts of megalithic construction that's now hundreds of feet underwater. And I think we have sea levels rising now, apparently, so it's not exactly controversial. We know they were much, much lower in the past because a lot of the water in the sea was tied up in ice during the ice age. So the question again is the impact on the collective psyche. And this, I think, is what whoever was generating the stories about the pandemic response in response to something off-world was thinking about how we would deal with that. Melancholia is a really interesting film by Lars von Trier, which deals with this. That's the core of the story. There's a lot of human psychodrama around that. But I'd recommend that film to anybody who hasn't seen it. The aforementioned Thomas Sheridan and another guest of mine, Neil MacDonald, did a very good review of this film in one of their, I think it was episode 11, but anyway, part of their Megaliths and Mysteries series, which you can find on YouTube. And it would beg the question, if the government response or global elite response to an impending threat off-world was to send us all home and lock us up, lock us down with our families, what else might it be? We see from fiction in films like When Worlds Collide, 2012, Armageddon, we see fictionalized accounts of what might happen. And of course, mass hysteria and panic is part of the response. So, one thing, whatever the story of the pandemic is, one thing that lockdowns have been attempting to do is just to lower the level of activity, just to stop people running around in the streets and screaming and setting fire to things. Black Lives Matter being the exception to that. Interesting wrinkle that somebody else brought to my attention was in the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, At one point on the moon base in the film, there's something that takes place there that must be kept away from wider attention. It must be kept hidden and secret. And so the authorities in charge invent the story of an epidemic to keep people away. You cannot come here. You cannot see what's going on. There's an epidemic. So again, that's what got me to thinking, is it possible it was like, you cannot look into what's happening here. There's a pandemic. You cannot have any further information. There's a pandemic. Do not ask questions. There's a pandemic. At the end of the day, though, having recently watched the film Elysium, whatever the theories about this current pandemic are, if this true story behind it was anything coming off world that was an existential threat to the Earth, that's a leveler, you know. There will be no Elysium for the elite to go to. We'll all be in the same boat. And at the end of the day, all of these elite controllers and people sitting, you know, high on the hill, they're susceptible to some kind of impact on Earth just as much as the rest of us are, I think. There really is no escape. To follow up on some of the areas that I've talked about, you can find some content at legalize-freedom.com. Most of those videos are also mirrored here on the YouTube channel. Interview with Robert Schoch, the geologist. In that, we talk about Göbekli Tepe and the fact that the site was buried and what the threat might have been from off-world. My interview with Graham Hancock, when we talk about catastrophism in general and a huge Earth impact and the possibilities for that in the future. And one with Andrew Collins, based on his book Cygnus Mystery, where we talk about cosmic rays. Again, all these off-world things that affect life on Earth, whether or not any of this has got anything to do with the pandemic response. At the end of the day, it seems, according to the scientists, that at some point in the far future, our sun will go supernova, expand constantly outward, destroying everything in the solar system and beyond as it goes. So one way or another, the end is in sight. Okay, until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com